Welcome, everyone. Delighted to have you here. My name is Maureen Conway. I'm a vice president at the Aspen Institute, and I lead our Economic Opportunities program. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's book talk about wealth supremacy, how the extractive economy and the biased rules of capitalism drive today's crises. Delighted to have Marjorie Kelly here and to be launching her book. Sales start today, right?
That's right. Today's the kickoff.
So today is the day. So we're excited to do that. And just to get started, just to mention this conversation is part of the Aspen Institute Economic Opportunities Program ongoing Opportunity in America discussion series, in which we explore the changing landscape of economic opportunity in the United States, the implications for individuals, families, and communities across the country, and ideas for change. Thanks to everybody for joining us today, both in person and virtually. We have a lovely virtual audience too. If this is your first time joining one of our events, we do record all of our events and host them on our website, so you can find them at as.pn/EOP events. So I'm super excited for today's book talk. It's a great book. I have written all over it, whatever. Really enjoyed reading it. So recommend. And it's really helpful, I think, to understand kind of the bigger picture challenges that we face. At the Economic Opportunities Program, we do a lot of work with a variety of different kinds of organizations across the country that are trying to connect people to better opportunities. So we work with kind of workforce organizations, we work with community colleges, we work with local government agencies, we work with community-owned finance institutions and other organizations supporting small businesses. So just this wide variety of organizations that are trying to sort of help people figure out how they can get a good job or how they can start a business and build a sustainable livelihood. And that's all really, really important work, right? And there's a lot of amazing organizations that do this work. But I've been doing this work for a lot of years now. And I have been sort of interested in this work as an anti-poverty strategy for a longish career now. And when I step back from that, it's like this is good work, and I've seen organizations make a real meaningful difference in some people's lives. But when I step back, those problems of poverty, of working poverty, of the racial wealth gap, of households that just don't even have $400 in an emergency, like these problems are just still with us. They haven't gotten better, and in some cases they've gotten worse. And so sort of stepping back from that, you kind of try to think about, like, what is this bigger picture that keeps challenging all that work. So, and I think that's kind of the piece that this book really starts to paint out. So there's a couple of other things I want to say about what I loved about this book. One, I think it's a nice kind of simple, compelling explanation for sort of what's happening with our economic system. So I'll admit I've actually studied quite a lot of economics in my past, but the truth is that you don't actually have to get very far in economics before you get to sort of like the inputs are, land, labor, and capital for our system of production. And what Marjorie sort of points out is, but the only one we actually care about in this system is capital, and land and labor are just there for not a very good ride. So that's kind of a problem for us. You kind of go, oh yeah, that probably isn't the most sustainable system. So I think she really kind of makes that argument that is kind of complicated, but makes it in a way that it's fairly straightforward. She goes also, I think, to the part that's complicated. I think she really explains well all of the sort of complicated financial jargon that kind of is used around how we sort of think about how things should happen, and uncovers kind of sort of the wealth bias, as you call it, within that jargon. And I think that's really well done. I particularly appreciate, though, that this book is not a finger-pointing book, right? It's not sort of like let's grab our pitchforks and whatever sort of thing, right? It really kind of names sort of this system that's on autopilot, that nobody kind of really sort of intentionally, there's no sort of malintent behind it. It's this kind of grew up and is now operating in a way that I think is not how any of us would sort of intend. And then the final thing I guess I wanted to say is I also really appreciate how the courage to kind of center values in a conversation about economics and finance. And I really like, economics is a social science, and you write, values form the moral heart of a social system. Yeah, but economics, much as economists, and my husband's an economist. Actually, some of my very best friends are economists. I really like economists. But nonetheless, they will sort of dress these things up in very fancy mathematical equations. And, but it is a social science. And you also write that morality in an economy is something we're taught is unneeded, irrelevant, possibly embarrassing. And I think, with that technical language and all the math around it and everything, when you start talking about sort of more human dimensions, people sort of, I think we can kind of feel like, oh, people are going to think I'm too soft, or, and I think that's been a real challenge in how we have our conversations about our economic system and what it's doing for us and what it's not. So the last thing I'll say, reading this book, I felt like, oh, you can think two things very much at the same time. Like you can say, oh, this is so true. And you can also say, nobody believes this. And and then you realize like, oh, actually, I think maybe people do believe this, but we just haven't really had the right frame for saying it. So last thing I'll say, this is the Aspen Institute. What do we love at the Aspen Institute more than anything? Dialogue. We love talking. And what I really appreciate is one of your chief recommendations was, we need to talk about this more.
Yeah.
So welcome to the Aspen Institute. We love to talk. So let's get talking. But before we get talking, I just want to do a couple of things for our live stream audience. So just a little housekeeping here. All attendees are muted. We welcome questions. We will have time at the end for Q&A. So I hope everybody in the room and online is ready for questions. Online, please use the Q&A box on your screen, and somebody in the room will sort of represent you. We also encourage you to share your rooms, and there's that chat function online. We have this great audience. You all are experts. You have things to share. You have experiences and perspectives. We love when you share that in the chat. Please introduce yourself and share those with us. Appreciate everybody's feedback. Online, there will be a survey that will pop up at the end. So please let us know what you think. Everybody in person and online can also always send us an email at eop.program@aspeninstitute.org to let us know what you think. We love people's feedback, and we're always trying to make things better. We also encourage you to tweet or whatever they call it these days. Our hashtag is Talk Opportunity. If you have any technical issues, you can put a note in the chat or email us, again, eop.program@aspeninstitute.org. Again, we're recording, and the email and the webinar will be shared via email and posted on our website. Closed captions are available. Please use the CC button at the bottom of the video to activate those. A note for everybody in the room: we are also having a book sale at the end of today's discussion. And 3 lucky contestants will win a free book at the end. So please stick around for that. And Marjorie will sign books at the end. So whether you buy one, whether you win a free one, whatever, whether you steal one, she'll sign it. Okay, I am done. Now,
Great.
So now we get talking. So Marjorie, you and I have been working on these issues for some time. I mentioned sort of a little bit of my journey on this. You do this work for a while, and you see things that are working really well that give you some optimism. But sometimes you step back and it's sort of like, wow, like we just still have such a way to go. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about your journey and what brought you to writing this book.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Maureen. Well, thanks everyone for coming. It's fun to have an in-person event, and of course people online too. Yeah, I've been doing this work for more than 30 years, Maureen. You and I have walked together in recent years. I started back in the late 80s. I started Business Ethics Magazine, and I wanted to only talk about good business people and good investors. I thought they would how you would change the world. And I met a lot of people trying to do so. I've known so many fabulous leaders in these fields, but I also saw things were getting worse and not better. You know, there was a time companies did not do massive layoffs, and now it's routine. Sending jobs overseas, demanding tax breaks from cities just to stay. Boeing demanded tax breaks at one point. They'd been in a city for 100 years, and suddenly they needed a tax break in order to stay. So there was a kind of ruthlessness I saw that was becoming more and more the norm, even though there was more social investing happening, going on. Every corporation had an ethics officer. They were all doing sustainability reports. And so all of these supposed ways to make corporations better were catching on, and yet behavior was getting worse. And I saw that the problems are systemic. It really goes down to the core aim of the system, which is, as corporations say, maximize returns to shareholders. And shareholders are the wealthy. 89% of shares are held by the richest 10%, and mostly by the upper reaches of that. You know, and also we saw plastics filling the ocean and birds dying. And so there was this crisis brewing, and so much of the change that we were working on didn't touch the essence of the system, which was in overdrive and on autopilot. That's really a lot of what I'm trying to say in the book, is that it isn't. Yeah, I mean, there are CEOs we can call on the carpet, and there are billionaires who we can point a finger at, and all of that is right. But if you eliminated all the CEOs and the billionaires tomorrow, and even the directors of, say, all the institutional investments, it wouldn't make any difference. The system would reconstitute itself. It wouldn't. The individuals don't, in the end, in a certain odd way, matter. Donella Meadows said this. She's a systems theorist, and was, unfortunately, no longer living. But Donella Meadows, do people know her? Or some people know that name? You should really look her up if you haven't. She said, the most effective place to intervene in a system is at the level of mind that gives rise to the system. What's the way of thinking? And the way of thinking is what I'm pointing out. I'm calling wealth supremacy. It's the idea that wealthy people matter more than others. We also call it capital. Capital is the working face of wealth. Capital holds the power. In corporations, only capital has a vote. Capital might have, might hold shares for a couple of minutes. And yet it has a power that workers who've been there for 30 years don't have. So workers are oddly considered outsiders in the corporation, whereas capital alone is considered an insider. And there's something, it's very Alice in Wonderland, that we believe that. It's a little bit like saying, well, only men are persons, or only white people are persons, right? That's a bias. And there's a bias going on inside our system, and it says only wealthy people matter. If you own capital, then you matter, and if you don't, then you don't matter. So I'm pointing this out, and as you said, Maureen, it's on autopilot, and so it's the mind. I think it's the mind of the system that we need to start talking about and challenging.
Yeah, that's great. And just to sort of start with this, I think you start this book with this example that I just found like horrifying, right? In terms of how this thinking gets applied to water, right? So we all need water. We're familiar with the crisis, unfortunately, in Flint and then Jackson, Mississippi. I mean, and we're looking at our climate change and everything, and places are running out of water, and there's a whole problem out west now, in terms of thinking about the Colorado River, and you write about how finance is thinking about water, and talk about that.
Yeah. So I opened the book with a story of a hedge fund out there buying water rights in Colorado and in California. There is another big financial conglomerate that's out there buying water rights. And Fortune magazine said a few years back, it said water is going to be to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th century. It's the precious commodity that determines the wealth of nations. And that's really right. The UN says by mid-century, 2/3 of the world is going to have a shortage of clean, fresh water. 2/3 of the world. Already there are wars over water that if you look at very, very deeply, it's water. And so how does big capital look at this crisis? They view it as an opportunity for what they call wealth creation. And I call it wealth extraction, right? They want to go out and buy water rights so that they can make money. When water becomes scarce, they want to charge a lot of money as a form of conservation. And there's something kind of crazy about that, frightening about that. And actually, they want to do it with ecosystem services in general. There was a new vehicle created on the New York Stock Exchange a couple years ago called natural asset companies. I don't know if anybody's tracking this, and this is part of what, when I talk about the sort of the mumbo jumbo, and there's a colonization by capital that's ongoing, but most of us don't see it. We don't think of finance as having anything to do with us, actually. And so, but the idea of natural asset companies is they want to own forests, they want to own coral reefs, and turn these into, monetize these ecosystem services as a new form of capital extraction. And I find it very, very frightening. But here's the interesting thing. I thought, well, there's going to be an outrage on the left about this, right? So I got on the internet. I'm going to look up and see who's raising a ruckus about this. Almost no one. We're not even talking about it. We're kind of asleep. We're like, capital is out there. They're already monetizing our identities. They want to own the gene code. Big companies. Walmart, I believe, is the largest company in the world. It's flattened mom and pop companies. Amazon has basically taken over the book industry. They sell more than probably 2/3 of all the books are being sold through Amazon. So there's this kind of colonization going on that we just take as normal. We think there's nothing we can do. We think it's normal, and it's frightening. And I think there's a lot we can do. So what I'm trying to do, first of all, is help us see what's happening.
Yeah. No, I thought it was so interesting, this point that, nobody's really noticing that, if I think about water, right? And I think, it is this idea that nothing can be publicly held sort of in a public trust, right? That everything can be sort of privately owned. And
yeah, that's right. That's right, Maureen. So we've been taught to fear public ownership. Yeah. That's communism. That's bad. Government's inept. Government can't do anything right. The private sector is more intelligent, more nimble. Well, right now, 85% of Americans, we get our water from a municipally or locally owned utility. And evidence shows that we have better service and lower costs as a result. Because if you have a municipally owned, and that means city government or maybe county owns and runs the water system, who are they accountable to? They're accountable to the mayor. They're accountable to the county supervisors. If you're upset about something, you can get somebody on the phone. You can raise a complaint, right? There's local accountability for water. And in particular in the UK, in the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher came in and privatized all kinds of things, including water and electricity and airports, and I don't know what all she privatized. But they found it was almost like she ran an inadvertent experiment in the difference between private control of water and public control of water. And they found that when you have private control of water, they raise the prices because, of course, they want to give money to their shareholders. They want to give big dividends to their shareholders. And how do they do that? They cut the service. They degrade the service. That's how you make more profit. And there's this one area, Thames Water, is one of the big private water firms in serving London. And there are people in London, they've had sewage gush into apartment windows in London. It's so bad. And there's a part of the Thames River that they now call Crappuccino. because it's so polluted from this water. So water should be a public trust. Water it should be governed in the public interest. It shouldn't be privatized. It shouldn't be used as profit maximization. And I use that example because one of the things I'm trying to say is there's two kinds of systems. There's extractive capitalism, and there's a democratic economy. And the democratic economy already exists in various pieces, and we can grow it. We can knit it together, and we can make that our next system. And it's not just small stuff. It can operate at scale too, and we do have this choice.
Yeah, great. And one of the things I think you do a nice job of is sort of explaining some of the terminology. And I was wondering if you just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of that. And particularly, I was thinking like this issue of fiduciary responsibility,
right?
And how that one has come up, right? Just talk a little bit about sort of like some of the words and what they mean.
Sure. That's good. Yeah. That's good. Thanks, Marie. I ran a small business for 20 years. I've lectured at a lot of business schools. In a lot of ways, I feel like I've been kind of a spy in the house of business for a long time. So I kind of get the operating system. And what I try to do in the book is unpack this operating system and show how it's threaded through with bias. And I try to do it in a way that's accessible to regular people, right? And strip away the mumbo jumbo. Well, one of the things I talk about is fiduciary duty, right? Fiduciary duty is a term that applies to investment management. If you place your investments with an investment advisor or a mutual fund or investment manager, they have an obligation to act in your interest and not go off and invest the money in their crazy uncle or go to the Bahamas or something, right? So that's right. That's legitimate. That's necessary. But what I say is that there's another piece hiding inside fiduciary duty, which we tend not to notice. And that is that only gains to capital matter, nothing else matters, right? So if you own a mutual fund and that mutual fund holds shares in Exxon, then fiduciary duty says, well, the job of Exxon is to drive up its share price and to have as much profit as possible. And preserving life on Earth, it doesn't count in fiduciary duty. So there's this, and there's a lot of people working on that and trying to change that. So I don't want to pretend that I'm the first person who's noticed this. But it's an example of how these technical terms, the fiduciary duty is part of the operating system of investment. And CEOs of corporations will say, well, I have a fiduciary duty to my shareholders. And that basically means don't talk to me about anything else. This is the only thing that matters. So it's intended as a conversation stopper. And what I'm trying to say is it's really a bias. It says creating more wealth for the wealthy is the only thing that matters. Nothing else matters. And it's embedded in the operating system of the economy. And let me give another example, and that's materiality. And these terms, they sound boring, they sound technical, right? But that's part of their superpower because we're taught, well, it's just technical stuff, right? So materiality, this is a rule of accounting, in finance, and of corporations, both. And what you're taught, and what the law professors will very sternly warn you, is that you have a sacred duty to take care of capital, to fiduciary duty to take care of capital, and you have to report anything that's material to investors. We might remember the woman who went to prison because she lied to investors about she was creating.
Theranos.
Is it Theranos?
Yeah.
Yeah, she was creating a new product and she pretended that it was working. It was a blood testing device and it didn't work. So she went to prison because she lied to investors. So anything she needed to report to investors. Well, by the way, our product doesn't work. Or if you have a lawsuit pending, you have to report that to your investors. It makes sense, right? That's if it's material means corporeal. It means physical, right? If I kick this podium, it would hurt my foot, right? That's material. But in the funny upside down world of financial accounting, what's material is what affects the ethereal numbers that affect shareholders. It affects share price, then it's material. If it's the physical earth, if it's degraded water systems, if it's people thrown out of jobs and their families are ruined, maybe for generations, not material. None of that's material unless it affects capital. So I say it's a perfect tautology of capital bias. If it matters, if it affects capital, it's real. It's material. If it affects anybody else, it's not material. It's not real. This is a formal principle of accounting. So those are just some examples of how the bias is hidden in the norms of the system.
Yeah, no, and like you say, there are people working on changing this in terms
Exactly.
of improving reporting about various things about environmental outcomes and those kinds of things. But yeah, these are the things that typically are not told. You know, if it's not material to capital, we just don't have to talk about it. Right. So it's, you know.
Right.
So yeah, so also, but let's also just talk about sort of, well, what does that end up meaning? Because I feel like it's also gotten to the point where we just sort of, you know, so we just accept that, okay, so this is good business. This is, you know, that's what you do to run a good business. And, you know, the result might be that, you know, students have a lot of debt, or, you know, people have mortgages they can't afford, they lose their homes, like, but it's just business, right? And, you know, sort of, so maybe talk a little bit about what we've come to accept, because, you know, how this sort of financialization of the economy has, you know, affected actually people's lives, and what we've just come to accept about that.
Yeah, this is good. We've been writing about this at the Democracy Collaborative, where I'm a fellow. There's a phenomenon that economists have actually warned us about literally for decades. It's called financialization. And I think of financialization as a problem as large as climate change. You might remember Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, and he had run around with his PowerPoint for many, many years. And there were all these complicated charts about how too much carbon emissions and it creates a greenhouse effect and blah, blah, blah. It was very, very frightening, but it was very technical at first. And I think that climate scientists had known about it long before it showed up in the public. I think something similar needs to happen with financialization. So financialization means there's too much financial wealth in the world. Now, that kind of blows our mind, right? Because we think of financial wealth as good. How can you have too much of it, right? But you can. And it's similar to carbon, because in the aggregate is when it becomes a problem, right? You know, those of us who are lucky enough to have a little bit of an investment portfolio, you get your statement and you see the numbers have gone up and you wish they went up more. And that's normal, right? In the same way that when you want to set your thermostat where you want to set it, and you want to drive your car as much as you want to drive it. But when we do these things as individuals, in the aggregate, we have an effect shows up that is counterintuitive. Wasn't what we intended. This has happened with financialization. So when there's too much financial wealth in the world, what that means is, you know, you're shifting income. For example, corporations shifting in from capital to labor when they send jobs overseas, when they take part-time jobs and make that the norm instead of having a full-time job. I mean, 40% of jobs are now part-time, contingent, insecure, gig, subcontract, various kinds. We don't even keep the score. I mean, this was a survey that the federal government did a number of years ago, and they don't even do it every year. A lot of jobs are now insecure, and that's one of the results of financialization, because we've been shifting more and more to capital, more and more to financial assets. You know, we talk about, you know, CEO pay being a problem. Well, CEO pay is about 95% stock options, so they only get paid in the big bucks if they get their share price up. rising portfolios of the wealthy also means rising debt for other people, right? So government, individuals, families are swimming in debt, college debt, mortgage debt. When there's too much healthcare debt, when there's too much money in too few hands, they're out there bidding on houses. Houses have become a new financial asset, and that drives up the price of housing. So the rest of us can't afford to buy houses. Young people can't get good jobs because the jobs have been sent overseas or turned into part-time. So there are all these effects that show up in the system when you have this aggregate level of financial wealth. And this is one of the key things that we need to start talking about.
Yeah. Do you remember the statistic? Because I don't remember it in the book, but how much financial assets versus GDP?
Oh, right. Yeah. So when I was a kid in the 1950s, financial assets as a whole were roughly equal to GDP. And GDP, gross domestic product, that just means all the flows of income and spending. You get a paycheck, you spend it, that's GDP, right? That's a flow of income and spending. But on top of that, there's really a sphere of financial assets, and that's business equity, it's bonds, it's other forms of debt. So when you look at all these assets in aggregate, they used to be equal to GDP. Now, financial assets are 5 times GDP, 5 times. And yet, the system tells us financial assets have to grow every quarter, every year, into infinity, and they have to grow faster than GDP. So what it means is they're sucking more and more income out of the real economy of jobs and spending, and sending it up into the sphere of the wealthy. Too much financial assets, it really it harms us.
Yeah, no, I thought that was so interesting because you talked about how all of those financial assets really represent kind of a claim on something that's in the real world, but now they're 5 times larger than what's in the real world. So you start to really get a feel for kind of the instability of that kind of a system.
Right.
Yeah, and I think about sort of like financier is a word that comes from the French of the pre-revolutionary France. It was the financiers supporting the Sun King there, Louis XIV. And I think about sort of before, in the late 1800s and early, and sort of going into the early 1900s and before the Great Depression, the U.S. was a very unequal, but also very unstable economy, right? Very big booms and busts. And I think this is kind of what happens when you have so much concentrated financial assets. It's, and so so it can be, so to your Inconvenient Truth movie about it, it can be, the consequences can be terrible.
And they can be huge. Yeah. And we tend not to trace them back.
Right.
I mean, I think it's taken a while for journalists to catch up with climate change. And now when you see about a hurricane or you hear, a dam that's broken or flooding, down in paragraph 3, it'll say, well, this flooding, this fire is likely related to climate change. So we're starting to connect the dots. We should do that with financialization when we see, massive layoffs or, 2/3
student debt crisis.
Student debt crisis. This is related to financialization. That's the kind of knowledge that we need. We need to understand this is a large process that's working against us, and we need to start connecting the dots.
Yeah. Can you also talk a little bit, because I think you do touch on this, sort of this intersection. I mean, you call it wealth bias, right, or capital bias, and we think of all kinds of biases in our society, right? But maybe you could talk about the intersection of sort of wealth bias and sort of racial bias and that kind of thing.
Yeah. That's a really important one, and thanks for bringing that up. A lot of wealth in our society originally came from extraction from people of color all over the world, right? I mean, it happened in this country through slavery and through redlining and the Tulsa massacre. Some black families start to get a little bit of wealth, and then what they have is torn down. And this happened worldwide with imperialism, where nations of color, particularly in Africa, were considered the overseas possessions of European countries. So this property, I think people of color understand better than anyone that property is a weapon. You know, we're taught that property is sacred and needs to be protected, and it does to a certain extent, but it's also a weapon that can be used against people. And so a lot of wealth came initially from extraction from people of color. And now, so one of the things I say in the book is that racial discrimination, or we'll say racial bias, inflicts harm across generations. There are people, you know, families don't own houses today and haven't had that run-up of wealth that housing has permitted for white families. So it inflicts harm across generations. Capital bias, okay, so racial bias, you know, continues. Capital bias accelerates. Because the more wealth, the more financial wealth there is, even more is needed next year. So there's this huge sphere of financial wealth, but it needs to keep growing. And so it's going to extract even more in the future. And that's why it's trying to financialize water. It's trying to financialize coral reefs and forests. It'll grab anything it can because it's this force that wants to grow exponentially. I mean, the first rule of the system is no amount of wealth is ever enough. That's the essential norm around which the whole system is built. And it's built into investment. You know, it's built into corporations. You buy stock, you want it to go up. You want that company to get bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, so this growth imperative is built in, and so what do we do about that? Well, we have to forefront racial equity, right? I mean, you know, accounting for debts is essential to any successful economy. There's a huge debt that's owed to people of color, and I think reparations is needed. But if you only focus on racial equity, what we're doing is we're leaving this extractive system intact to keep running, and it's going to extract from all of us, including people of color, who are going to be hit first and hardest as always, right? But it's now extracting from the environment. It's extracting from working people of all colors, and so you need to look at both. And this can sound, you know, kind of pie in the sky. But here's an example. At the Democracy Collaborative, we helped build the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, and these are they're in an inner city that's predominantly people of color, and we worked with large anchor institutions like Cleveland Clinic and other university hospitals to bring their laundry to this commercial laundry that's owned by workers. And initially, 60% of the workers were formerly incarcerated. That was a deliberate hiring decision, right? So we're gonna empower workers through worker ownership. We're gonna forefront people of color in that. And by the way, we're gonna power this company through anchor institution contracts, and it's successful. There's a couple hundred workers now own this company doing commercial. They're doing all their laundry for Cleveland Clinic. So the steps that we take, the models that we build are very down to earth, and they work. I mean, but understanding the big problem, I think, helps us understand the nature of the solutions.
Yeah, great. Because that was what I was going to go to next, because I think there is this, you know, there is this, it doesn't have to be this way, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, it's funny, you know, talk about things and we talk about sort of financialization and this kind of thing. It can, like, you know, you get the, like, so what do you want? Like public ownership, like communism, whatever, right? And it's sort of like, well, no, that's not what I'm saying, right? You know, sort of mm-hmm. like, you know, I think, you know, it's sort of like we want to make free markets actually free of like wealth bias and make them work for all the market actors, not just some of them, right? So, let's talk about a little bit about some of these examples that you've seen. Mm-hmm. You just talked about that. You've talked about sort of management of forests, right. Other places right. around the world that we see these kinds of systems. Talk a little bit about examples of, you know, how it actually can be otherwise.
Yeah, well. One of the things we need is a great ownership transition. We can't have the 1% owning everything, right? and so that includes people a chance to own their own homes, free of debt, if we can imagine such a thing. It means people need to own their workplaces. We need a big movement for worker ownership. And Maureen, you've done a lot of great work on that. We helped, some colleagues of mine helped design the Fund for Employee Ownership at the Evergreen Co-ops in Cleveland. They're using investor capital, buying companies, converting them to employee ownership. So workers are the owners in the end, and there's money to be made for investors without having to own everything. So those, we need, and we do need public ownership. I think that's part of the equation. I mean, land and water. I have a colleague who's working on public ownership of pharmaceuticals. California is now starting to manufacture their own insulin because it's too expensive, right? So I think we do need more public ownership, and we need to begin to think, well, where does that make sense? Water is an obvious one. We also need the worker ownership in various forms of trust ownership and collaborative ownership. And then we also need what I call the next system of capital. One of the things I did one of the fun things about writing the book is I said, well, okay, so could you still have a modern, sophisticated financial system in a democratic economy? What would that look like? So I did a gathering about a year ago. I gathered 15 experts who were working in different aspects of you could call it democratic finance. And we came up with a series of pathways that I think pretty much add up to a next system of capital. One of the things we need is debt forgiveness. If you're going to have all these overblown financial assets, in a lot of it's debt, you need to have mechanisms for forgiving debt. And Biden was doing this with education debt. He also did it with debt for black farmers, which then people took them to court and alleged racism, which of course was not what was going on. But so debt forgiveness, and I talk, for example, about debt for nature swaps. There was like several $100 million in Belize. A lot of these developing nations are burdened with debt right now. There's a debt crisis. Well, they can write down, I think this was about a 50% write down. So in other words, you forgive half the debt. And in return, Belize said, we're going to preserve forests, we're going to preserve mango groves, we're going to preserve all kinds of ecosystems. That's very different than the natural asset companies where you want Wall Street owning ecosystem services. No, this is trusts and preserved areas. So you're writing down some assets, and in return, you're preserving the natural world. That's a really great example, I think, of how we can begin to get beyond all this debt. I will add that Germany at the end of World War II was swimming in debt. And through currency reform, there was a massive write-down of about 90% of their debt. And that turned Germany into the powerhouse that it is today. So there's a long history, a successful history of debt forgiveness. And it needs to become dimensionable. Right. The right wing, is horrified that any debt would be forgiven, but it needs to become a mentionable solution. And let me add another one. So as you want to sort of write down some of this debt, we also want to build up the assets of those who don't have assets, right? One of the people we brought to our gathering was talking about baby bonds. Baby bonds, I mean, every young person ought to have, a few assets starting out in this world. And let's create bonds that will give these assets. And if you do it by income or by wealth, then you sort of sidestep some of the problems of racial discrimination, which are people going to scream about. But you can achieve the same result, I think, by looking at wealth, the wealth deficit. So baby bonds, that's another example. There's a bunch of examples that we looked at, local investing, impact investing. And we actually could, I'm convinced now that we actually could have a modern, sophisticated financial system that in a democratic economy that's designed to serve us rather than extract from us.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to ask you one more question, but I really do want to get to audience questions. So please be thinking of them and online as well. And you know, my colleagues, I'm interested in this idea. You talk about community wealth building, and I have wonderful colleagues in our community strategies group. Chris Desies, Benita Roberts, my former colleague Janet Topolsky, all did lots of great work on this issue of community wealth building and really thinking about I'm just wondering if there is a place that sort of stands out for you as kind of like a model of this, or something for people to think about in thinking about how this makes a difference in a community and how a community lives.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Our organization, the Democracy Collaborative, devised this term, community wealth building, back in 2005, and it's about local economic development. It's about building assets. It's about transforming communities by having them own and control their own assets, right? And one of the most exciting places that this, I work with a couple of colleagues who are doing this around the US and around the world in some very exciting ways. And one of the places that has done this is Preston, England. And this is a Rust Belt city. It was very broken down. And they took on, the city council got excited about community wealth building and said, this is how we're going to do economic development. They had all of their anchor institutions, including the schools and the police, the university, sign a pledge. We're going to invest locally. We're going to hire locally. We're going to buy locally. So all of a sudden, hundreds of millions of dollars that had been spent outside the community was now being spent inside the community. They also said we're going to build worker-owned firms. So they actually, and there are a number of processes. You want to look at land, you want to look at housing, all of these things you want to have as community assets. And they actually moved the needle on poverty and unemployment in Preston. Preston has recently been named the best place to raise a family in the UK. So by community wealth building as an economic development form, they actually move the needle in this community. So it's very exciting. My colleagues now have more work than they can do. People coming at us wanting to do community wealth building. Because mayors, city councils, they know their communities are in trouble. They're looking for something different. And this is a form of economic development that works and is starting to catch on, I'm happy to say.
Yeah, great. Great. Would love to hear if there's questions in the audience or online.
Hi, my name is Kyung-sun. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with the Economic Security Project. Thank you so much for sharing what you shared. One of the questions that I have is, when we talk about the big forces that are driving wealth extraction, a lot of the times we know we're talking about the big corporations, big pharma, big food, et cetera. And I find that along with that analysis, we start having these narratives as advocates of stop private, do more public. And in that conversation, I feel like we lose the small business community. And I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about, especially, coming from Missouri, oftentimes our small business owners are also our local legislators or our state legislators. And so would be curious to hear your thoughts about how we bring them into the conversations around wealth extraction and other forms of community wealth building that also makes them feel like they have a role in this process.
That's great. Thanks for that. And I am from Missouri, from Columbia, Missouri, and thanks for noticing that. I think I'm a huge advocate of small business and family-owned businesses. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how that there's a conveyor belt always functioning. Very few family businesses make it to the second or third generation as a family business. You sell to a multinational, you sell to a competitor. So we're always losing our businesses into this conveyor belt of ownership by big capital. So I would love to see family businesses supported or able to sell to other local buyers or sell to workers. There's kind of a movement, and Maureen's been helping to lead this, to have financing, so to sell to workers. So that's a kind of a built-in buyer for your business, and it's a way to preserve that business locally, and you're not going to lose jobs and so on. Yes, I think that small business and family businesses are our allies. And we need to distinguish. I make a distinction in the book between businesses that are profit making and those that are profit maximizing. And it's like the difference between being a social drinker and an alcoholic. I ran a small business for 20 years. You got to have more money coming in than going out. I mean, that's true. That doesn't mean you have to make every dime off every back that you can. And we're kind of hoodwinked if we think that profit maximizing is a requirement. It's not. And I think family businesses know that. So yeah, and I think, small business, family businesses, they're being taken advantage of by Amazon, which takes 34% of every sale. Now you tell me it doesn't take that much money to run that platform, right? So there's a lot of gouging going on. I think those are our allies, and I'd love to see us support them more. And one of the odd things, two odd things. Number one, banks don't serve small and medium-sized businesses. Because all of they used to be thousands of community-owned banks in this country, and they all got rolled up into Bank of America and Citigroup, and now we don't have the local banks that we used to have, and so you have these distant headquarters. They don't lend to local businesses. Local businesses have a hard time getting bank lending. Also, it's almost impossible to invest in businesses next door, right? Probably almost all of us are invested in Amazon with not knowing it, because they're in the index funds that we're in. But can we invest in a business next door? No, we can't, because we haven't built the roads to do so, and we need to do that.
Yeah, and I also appreciate you bringing up that the small business owners are often your legislators and that sort of thing. And I do think, I have been doing a lot of work on employee ownership and building that in. And I will say, in conversations that we've had on the Hill and everything else, it's a very bipartisan kind of support for that strategy. I think a lot of people see that as resonant with their values of responsibility, of fairness, of valuing entrepreneurship and that sort of thing. I think there's a lot to think about in trying to engage the small business community in this question. So thank you for that. Yeah.
You can stay seated because it will interfere with the mic.
Say what?
You can stay seated.
Oh, okay, thanks. Okay. I gotta get my proper instructions here. I mean, first of all, I think the origin of all wealth is human labor. In other words, wealth doesn't fall from the sky. Those forests you describe in some place or other, they're not worth anything until someone cuts down the trees or fertilizes them or turns them into lumber, et cetera, et cetera. So all wealth is a product of human labor. The fact that some people are able to exploit other people, they accumulate more wealth. The bigger people like Jeff Bezos, they have a lot of people to exploit, and they become very wealthy. The small businessman, he only has a few people working for him, so he becomes a little wealthy. But the bottom line is this inequality persists because of the way the system is organized. So it seems unless you take a different system, which does away with the idea of commodity production, producing things and making things to make more money, exploiting labor, you're not going to solve this problem. And we've seen it go on. I mean, this has been going on for hundreds of years. It's Thomas Pinckney wrote a book how, a couple years ago, how the people with money continue to make more money and workers continue to get poorer. And the more wealth you have at the top, the more poor people you have at the bottom. So until you eliminate that very system, I don't see how you're going to make any fundamental changes. So it's the whole capitalist system that creates these problems. Unless we're going to break with that and go to a different system, which production is based on need, rather than on profit, I don't see a way out.
Yeah, my wife the other day picked up Karl Marx, Capital, and he says I've read Marx. Says exactly that all wealth is theft and comes from labor. I don't want to get into that argument, but and of course Marx was a brilliant analyst and has a lot to teach us. But what I like to talk about is a democratic economy. I think that's designed for all of us. I think a lot of families want to have a few assets, and I don't think that's a bad thing. But I think there's a way that when assets are held broadly and we have a right to the wealth that we create, that's when you start to have the economy that I think can work for all of us. So thank you for your remarks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Dr. Alexander, Institute for Academic Management. I'm totally thrilled with your presentation. I've not read your book. I can't wait to read your book because there's a lot of England in there. So that's fabulous, which brings to my mind, in coming to the US and studying as a foundation in the UK, why we don't see more community wealth building, why we don't see more academics to apprenticeships to entrepreneurships, and why we find that in the poorer communities, the money doesn't stay in the communities, it goes outside of the communities, where in some communities it does stay in the communities, and that's what generates wealth building. So we're not reading your book. I don't know where education and the education system falls, and if you could answer, where are we missing the mark? I'm about to launch an academy just for that.
Nice.
Because that's a way to then generate generational wealth per se, and then to go into home ownership and other aspects. But the entrepreneurship, apprenticeship to entrepreneurship, you can't go wrong with it. And I'm sure Preston did a great job with that as well.
Yeah. Thank you for your remarks. I love your accent. It's very lilting. It's lovely to listen to. I think education is critical because, like as I said, the mind that this system arises from is the critical point of intervention. And so I think helping young people or learners of all ages that there is another way to do things. One of the pieces of work I'm most proud of that I've done over the years is I worked with a woman who did a Lakota translation of community wealth building. Because she took the community wealth building framework, she took it to her, she was Native American, she was Lakota, and began talking with women, and they realized this is exactly what had happened in Native American reservations, that the wealth had been extracted from their reservations. And she began to say, well, if we're going to have economic development, let's not bring in some white-owned business. Let's have a native-owned business. And so she began to sort of permeate this mindset there on the reservation. And she helped start a cooperative of women quilters. I was happy to say I bought one of their quilts. It's doesn't exist anymore. I'm sorry to say, a cooperative ownership model doesn't necessarily make a successful business all by itself. But anyway, yes, I think translating community wealth building into different cultural contexts is critical. And I'd love to see that happen, you said, in your community, because I think that this process has happened all over the world, to communities all over the world. And community wealth building is how we can begin to take back economic power in a way that works. And I think education is critical. So thank you.
We can go to an online question. Sure. So I'm going to combine a few online questions here. So in a world of antithopy, where do we start? Who are we trying to reach? What is the message? How do we reach them? And what are some of the key myths? Could you build a little bit more on the key myths that we need to kind of dismantle?
Yeah, so the book has 7 myths that I unpack. I talked about a couple here: fiduciary duty, materiality. There are others. So who are we trying to reach? One of the questions, as I've been out talking, the book is just out today, but I've been doing a little bit of talking up till now. And one of the questions that I often get is people go, well, what do you say to people who disagree with you or who are opposed to you? And I say, I don't think we start there. I remember back in the 70s when second wave feminism came, you don't start a feminist revolution by arguing with your dad. He may be the one who needs to change, but that doesn't mean you start there. You start with each other. We talk to each other, we strengthen each other, we have the frames, we have the understanding, the knowledge together, and we have solidarity with each other. I really think that the movement for system change needs that kind of solidarity. There's a lot of siloed work happening, but we don't recognize each other as colleagues in a similar movement. And I think we need to do that, and that will strengthen all of our work. So I think that's where we start. I think we start with talking with each other.
Wow, we have a lot of questions now. So we'll just do like maybe 1, 2, 3 and take them all at once. And maybe get the gentleman back.
Hi. So I'm an urban planning student, so this will kind of shape my question a little bit. You talk about like community owned and that kind of thing. I was kind of wondering if you've done any work or if you've seen any work that is done where maybe not a governmental structure owns an asset like actual land or buildings and that kind of thing, but there's an alternate organization that owns it in trust for the community, so that rents and other things go back into the community, as opposed to just a business structure where you have workers and they own and that kind of thing. So
Okay, I'm going to hold this. So alternate ownership, I know the answer is yes, and you can talk about that. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for your sharing. I'm just wondering, you talked about like how financial assets have like sort of like expanded exponentially over the last decades, and at the same time we are seeing like governments cutting spending in local communities and even governments going bankrupt, like Birmingham recently did. So what do you think the government can do more to ensure or to make the wealth that these like big corps extracted from the community and bring that wealth back into bring it back into the community and back to citizens' hands?
Great. I'm going to stop you at a time of financial abundance. Why do governments have no money? And
First of all, thank you. I guess as a person trained in the social sciences, I'm thinking that part of the solution is to look to the social sciences and to fundamentally put the human being back at the center. Because I'm just going to use one example. Let's say many of the countries in the global south that ask for advice from the multilateral lenders, the first thing they tell them is to sell your minerals to the rest of the world.
Right.
Which of course pollutes the environment, lowers life expectancy and a number of other horrible things. And so there's no long-term thinking, and the human being is left out of the equation.
Yeah, I think absolutely right.
now you can answer all 3 because we don't have very much time. So I had
human beings need to come back in the equation, and all of us matter. An economy exists for all of us. It doesn't exist just for corporations and for capital. And that's what the free trade regime has sold us, basically, is corporations and capital have power and nobody else does. So you're right. And I think the social sciences are critical. Values are at the heart of this. And we can bring values into our economy. We're taught that values don't matter, but really the only value that matters is financial wealth. That's the one value that the system values. And we're saying, no, actually there are other things we care about, like life, and the planet, and people. So thank you for that. A quick question about government not owning everything. I think you're absolutely right about that. And there are models out there. An example is community land trusts, where the community, a nonprofit owns the land, it leases houses for 99 years, and then it sort of it keeps houses off the speculative market and keeps them affordable. And usually you have community voices in the government and governance and so on. So yes, I think that government can be a catalyst, and yet you can have other forms of ownership that are in charge, trusts. There's a variety of models. So thank you for that question. And then what was the other one? Oh, about the role of government. Yes, local governments are feeling austerity. So what we're seeing with community wealth building, a number of communities we're working with, is you have a variety of players. It's not just government. You want government at the table, but you want CDFIs, community development financial institutions. You want other forms of nonprofits at the table too, working together. So you have communities working to build community wealth. And at the federal level, I want to give a shout out to Elizabeth Warren, who's my senator from Massachusetts, who happened to be on the plane when I was coming in from Boston. So that was kind of a treat. She is one of the smartest I think, federal legislators about this. And she has said, for example, the Accountable Capitalism Act, she's floated that says any company over $1 billion in revenue needs a federal charter. They have to serve a variety of stakeholders. They have to become a B corporation, essentially, not just serving stockholders. And 40% of board seats should go to workers. I love that. It's an example of how corporations need to evolve. They can't just be serving shareholders. That's just silly, given the emergency that we're in right now. That's one piece. She's also talked about reining in private equity, which we won't get into that, but I'll tell you, the game for investors is no longer in the public stock market. It's in private equity, which has swelled from 1 to 10 trillion. And it's not accountable. It's not transparent. And she has floated legislation to rein in private equity. So those are some examples that need to happen that will help to spread the wealth and keep the wealth extraction from being so extreme.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate this. I think this is really great. You did a good lightning round there. So I want to give you a round of applause.
This was fun. Thank you. I enjoyed this. Good questions.
Yeah, and hopefully everyone will keep talking about this and thinking about this. I do think it's important to, to ask questions and to feel like you can. So
Great.
So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate everybody's engagement today. And I'm going to turn it over now to Matt for the grand prize drawing.
So we drew 3 names for the book. If your name is Lydia Ma, Hassan Tyler, and Angela Christian, you can see us outside.
Wonderful.
And, we'll give a book.
Congratulations!
Nice.
Marjorie will be outside here willing
Happy to sign books.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone. This was
All
fun.
right. Thank you.